KGVO,
Missoula's news and weather station.
Everyone, it is hour number one of Talkback, brought to you by Kootenai Creek Village, the maintenance-free active adult community at Stevensville, where they offer the best of Western Montana living. Dig It Excavating, they bring 30 years of excellence to every job. Transport Equipment is your headquarters for RV service maintenance and repair, just south of the Y. And Selway Armory on Stockyard Road, more guns and ammo than anyone in Missoula, Montana's premier firearms dealer. Okay, we have a room full of guests, Mr. King. So they're all from the University of Montana, familiar guests. So let's talk about who we have in the studio today.
Well, I think I'll pass the mic over to Mehrdad since he can pronounce all of the names. With a name like Mehrdad, I think he's probably pretty well proficient in pronouncing other people's names.
Well, by now you pronounce it beautifully, John.
Thank you, Dr. Kia.
Good morning to you, Peter and John. Thank you very much for hosting this wonderful show. So this is going to be a two-part show today, for just a little bit to lay the foundation and some of the issues, and tomorrow a longer show to sort of answer some of the calls. But in general, the show will focus on issues confronting the university in the coming academic year and some of the solutions that we are proposing in the coming weeks and months. So I'm very privileged to have with me several of my colleagues. And since somebody in Helena said that we are just Doug Coffin and Mehrdad Kia with the email list, we just wanted to show that we are many more. And so I will start with my colleague Doug. And I will ask everybody to introduce themselves. And then tomorrow we will be talking a little bit more in detail. Doug, please, we'll start with you.
Good morning, and thanks again, Peter and John, for inviting us. I'm Doug Coffin. I'm a professor in the School of Pharmacy. I've been an advocate for higher education for many, many, many years. I've been at the University of Montana about 20 years now, and I'm a scientist. I do cardiovascular research, but lately we've been fighting for our university.
And Doug, can you say a few words about what you will be sort of highlighting tomorrow in terms of some of the solutions to the issues confronting our university?
We need to get the message out that public education across the country, Montana and Missoula and the University of Montana are not alone in this compared to the pre-Great Recession levels. About 46 states have cut their funding for higher education. In fact, Montana has not. But the problem is we started so low that even the increase isn't getting it done for us. Yeah. So it's a matter of trying to get the message out for what public education is, what we do, and the virtues and values of it to our country and our economy.
And you have been talking and working diligently about a proposal, basically. Could you talk a little bit? Could you elaborate on that?
In response to this, particularly into the horrible impact, the huge impact of well over $1 trillion, nearly $1.5 trillion in debt that we've racked up on students, because when public funding goes down, the burden gets shifted onto the students. And our students pay 3/4 of the cost for maintaining our university, and it used to be 1/4. So now they're carrying around $200 to $400 a month, and sometimes much more. I know students who have $1,000 a month for student loan payments. And that hurts all of us, because that means that when they pay that money to the government now, because student loans are a government program, most of them, they're not buying cars. They're not renting apartments. They're not buying houses. They're not going to restaurants and so forth and so on. And I think a lot of people in Missoula and in Montana, across Montana, can feel that. A lot of the merchants and business economy.
Just to step in on this. So I'm one of these families where we're paying a lot of money in student debt. I've almost personally paid off my own student debt, but my wife is becoming a nurse practitioner, so we're paying loads of money out for that, right? But the idea of it is that we're paying in long-term investment, and that it will pay us back in the long run because we're investing in education. I think the real problem is when people put money into education and yet don't get that education, or pay money into education and don't complete their degree program and end up not being able to market themselves in any way. Do you think the University of Montana has a completion problem?
Well, The graduation rate for the University of Montana runs right around 50%, and that's right around the national average. And K through 12, it runs about 80%, maybe even pushing 90% now. But there's a fundamental difference in that we're dealing with adults, and adults get married, they get divorced, they move, they get jobs and leave and so forth. So these are emancipated people compared to K through 12, where there is compulsory education up to age 16. So there's a big difference there. And a lot of the students, which is one of the issues for why the completion rate is lower. But the other one is that, quite frankly, a lot of students can't afford to stay in school.
There's also another big difference, Doug, and that is public schools are completely funded by the taxpayer.
Exactly.
So the families, unless you're going to private school, religious school, or whatever, there is no bill at the end of when you become a senior in high school. You don't have this massive bill to pay off. But when you go into college, culture shock, boom.
That's right. You could go to the University of Montana website and look at the budget for a student for a year, and it would come to about $18,000 to $20,000, and about a third of that is tuition. The other $12,000 are living expenses. And that's the hardest part for students to deal with. The tuition is difficult, don't get me wrong, but coming up with that other $12,000. And so right next to that budget, you'd see a list of, it's a ledger, a balance sheet, you'd see a list of potential income. And a Pell Grant, a full Pell Grant, is about $5,500. Then they're expected to take out student loans to cover the rest and work for part of it. And our debt-free degrees program that we took from Bernie Sanders and to some extent from Hillary Clinton says the state needs to kick in. When I was in New York State, my tuition assistance grant, and if you look online, you'll see the average tuition assistance grant across the country for state funding is about $3,000. So imagine what we could do in Montana if, first of all, we were willing to go to the federal government and say, let's up the Pell Grant to where it used to be for my generation. It's been cut over the years. It hasn't kept up with inflation. Let's up that, and let's make the states kick in, okay? So that the student could work 10 to 20 hours a week and maybe kick in $2,000, $3,000 that way. We get a federal grant, we get a state grant, and it's all means tested, so the wealthier students can kick in more in relative terms. So that's what we're after.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break. 721-1290 is our number. If you have a comment or a question, that's what Talkback's all about. By the way, the radio program of the year, according to the Montana Broadcasters Association. Thanks to folks like these, and also thanks to you guys as well. 721-1290, we'd love to have you participate. We'll be right back. Okay, we're back on Talkback. 721-1290 is the number. 1-800-568-5309. Before we get to callers, though, Louis, I knew you wanted to bring up a
Thanks,
topic.
Peter. My name, of course, is Louis Schneller, and I've been an activist, community activist with the group here, the University of Montana Advocacy Coalition. Got started with a golf course and the project we did to try to maintain and preserve and keep the open space.
That's where I first met you.
Yes.
What you would affectionately call the Geritol League.
And the Geritol League, yes. We move rather slowly, very slowly.
But you do move.
Yes, we do. But, I just want to make a quick point. In 1961, that's a long time ago, 55 years ago to be exact, when I went to the university here, tuition and fees, board and room, total cost $980. That was not a huge sum of money. It was easily paid for by a combination of parents and kids working during the summers. Well, I'm aghast today at what the huge cost to go to school. I wouldn't be able to afford it based upon the standards that I was living at that time. So I'm very concerned about these things. I'm just pleased as punch to be part of this advocacy group and to be here promoting the best interest of the university and, of course, our community, Missoula, this beautiful town we live in. Thank you.
Okay, so now you want to make a statement too. Would you please identify yourself?
My name is Hélène Bourdon.
Okay.
I was a graduate from the university many years ago. I'm not counting them. I have 2 kids trying to get a degree. And as a parent and as a graduate, I feel that we have to come together as a community to make this university thrive again and give our kids the best education they can have.
Okay, so real quickly, I don't want to get back over there. What do you think is your number one idea for helping to do exactly what you just described?
Well, it's not one, we have to, I'm sure we have to do several things.
Sure, I'm just at the top of your
top
list.
Of my head,
yeah.
I think we need to recruit students from other states, from other countries. And I think, as my friend Louis said, we have to lower those the price of going to university and getting a degree. Also, I still find it shocking that only half of the student population gets a degree at the end. We got to do better than that.
Okay, let's try to get a couple of phone calls here. So we'll get Mark. You are on first. Good morning and welcome to Talkback. Go ahead.
Good morning. I got a question that might lower the cost for the universities across the USA. Is if the faculty got free housing, but of course they'd have to take a cut in pay, would that work?
Okay, let's ask our faculty members. So, free housing, would you be willing to put up with less money if you got free room and board, basically?
Well, we could certainly look at something like that. In fact, I know a lot of universities, like Pepperdine in California that's in Malibu, they can't even hire faculty unless they subsidize their housing.
Right.
So they do that in some areas across the country, very expensive places to live. They subsidize housing for their faculty. Otherwise, they couldn't hire them.
Okay, let's get back to the phone. And Catherine, you're on Talkback. Go ahead.
Okay. The administration has expanded greatly over the years at the university. Has the percentage of the cost of education increased because of that? And how about pensions? Are they fully funded? And then there's been a continual increase over the last decades and a massive upgrade in building on campus. And how does that impact the costs of tuition?
That's it. We're working without headphones, so I have to turn the mics off while you're talking, Catherine. So, Doug, did you want to tackle some of those? Go ahead.
Sure. The administrative costs are always a target and should be, and that's an area where we should have efficiencies. They haven't gone up tremendously, but I think we're always looking for efficiencies there. There are certainly some new positions that have been created. There are some real questions about that people have.
Now, what about the building program?
The buildings are an issue, actually, particularly when your enrollment goes down. The fastest part of our flexible budget, our general fund budget, has been operations and maintenance. So Missoula College is going to come online. That's going to cost a lot to operate and maintain. We've got the new athletic facility. Now the athletic department is going to pay the bulk of that, but some of it will still come through to the university. We've got the new Gilkey building. So at operation, it's not so much the cost of building the building initially, it's the operations and maintenance long term that really put a burden on the budget.
Okay. So, Catherine, does that help you?
No, that's fine. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks for the call. Okay. I'm sorry. Go ahead, John.
Looks like we have a few questions and comments on Facebook. The first one might sting a little, so I'll get that one out of the way. Greg says, going to the University of Montana and going $31,000 into debt so that those men and women pictured in this picture, and this is a picture of you folks in the hallway, could have me pay their retirement and benefits was one of the worst choices I ever made. So I guess that's a letter to the administration maybe. And then Chad says, I feel that one of the biggest problems with college students and student debt is there are so many degrees offered for jobs or careers that have almost zero job opportunities available after school. For example, art history or maybe costume design. Why pay $50,000 to major in costume design? So there's his take.
Anyone? Go ahead, Michelle. Michelle
Yes,
Valentin.
this is a very good question, but it's relatively easy to answer. The problem is a divorce between skill-based education and critical knowledge-based education. There shouldn't be such a hiatus or divide. And it should be up to people like, of course, the Senate, the administration, and faculty to pair those two types of knowledge together. You could have costume design and work in a garment factory. They are not exclusive. You could be a carpenter and learn Spanish. Especially today, everything is possible. It's just a question of bridging that artificial break, which is widening, by the way, but divide. But one doesn't exclude the other. You can be very good with your hands and recite poetry while making love.
Well,
I'd like to.
Do they offer that class?
and
It's in the works.
it obviously grades on the curve, if you know what I mean.
We should address the pension. A couple callers have asked about the pensions, and the university system. The faculty are on a 401k like program. It's called a 403b. So it's like that thing where you contribute to your pension plan. We don't have that defined benefit program like a lot of other federal or state employees.
Now, may I ask, how is the health of your pension program? Is it funded, or are you behind, or what?
There is no health to it because it's a 403b, 401k like thing. So it goes into, you have your own TIA.
So it's self-funded.
It's
right.
self-funded.
Okay.
It's what we call a defined contribution plan. The university kicks in, but the level that they kick in, the combined contributions, is one of the lowest in the country.
Okay.
So if you're looking for efficiencies, the efficiencies being paid by our pension.
Okay, we're gonna
lack thereof.
We're gonna come right back. 721-1290 is our number. 1-800-568-5309. Still a few minutes left with these folks, but they'll be here tomorrow as well. So stay with us. We'll be right back. Okay, we are back on Talkback and rapidly running out of time because we are going to continue this conversation later, but we want to kind of lay a little bit of a foundation. So in the 5 minutes we have left, so Mehrdad, you want to jump in and start?
Yeah, so as you just mentioned, we will have a more detailed discussion tomorrow. As some of your listeners may know, we were also informed about significant cuts after the end of the semester in May, and we will include that discussion in terms of the impact of those cuts on the curriculum, on our course offerings, for fall and spring, and some of the operational cuts that many departments, especially in the College of Humanities and Sciences, should introduce or have introduced already, in fact. So that's going to be, a good part of our discussion. But the discussion will also include the impact of these cuts on the community and on the local economy, which are of tremendous importance as far as we are concerned. Yeah.
Doug, anyone? Here we are. We have several minutes left. So
I wanted to ask a question. So Doug dropped this policy at the very beginning of the show. I just want to know: is this like Doug's policy, or are you guys all in on this? Is that something that is kind of like widely agreed on? Is that what we're all pushing for, or what?
Well, we've got a lot of support for it. We've brought it to what we're trying to do is get the administration and the Board of Regents and so forth to get on board, and they get into a funding battle, an allocation battle with the legislature and the governor over it, because they see if you fund the students, then the university system loses money, at least the way they see it. So we're trying to square that circle or whatever.
A couple of questions. First of all, Doug, there's almost a whole new group of leadership at the University of Montana, okay? Many of the old guard have retired, other folks coming in. Have you had a chance to visit with them and sound them out to see if they have perhaps more progressive ideas or more open to the things that you folks have been suggesting?
We really haven't. We met with President Engstrom and the commissioner last semester. We haven't met with many of the new administrators at all. We're hoping to.
Okay.
Because funding the students
Louis.
has to be something that we get on board with. Most of the other states do it. We're never going to have affordability, accessibility. We're never going to get that graduation rate up unless they have the support they need. They need to kick some in. Don't get me wrong. It's not a free ride.
And Doug, you want to talk about just the Facebook that is up, and a lot of this information is on there. So the listeners, if they want to visit the Facebook, that would be...
Sure, we have a Facebook page, the UMAC. So if you search UMAC, you'll find our faces on the Facebook.
It's UMAC, which stands for University of Montana Advocacy Coalition.
Yeah, so if you search that, you'll find our group, and you'll find a page, and you'll see our faces on Facebook.
Okay, Louis, you first, then Michelle. Go ahead.
Last semester, for spring semester, the Commissioner of Higher Education took the time out to come from Helena and spend an hour's meeting with us. It was more than an hour. It went for 2 hours. And we were in the process of sharing information, discussing, educating all of us for his concerns and our concerns alike. And it was a great, productive meeting, very friendly, very cordial, and very respectful. And yet we were exchanging these wonderful ideas, some of the topics of which Doug has espoused, and several of the other group members of the group. There were students there. There were faculty members there. There were members of the community, including myself. And these are... Yes, yes. And these are the kinds of things that have to continue, because it seems to me as a community member that the problems with the university do not seem to fully register in the minds of the ordinary person. And somehow or another, we need to be able to elevate that conversation so that people can become concerned about it enough to be engaged and maybe help us find solutions, because that's what we're really all about. The advocacy group is solution-oriented.
Okay, Michelle, we got about a minute.
Yes,
Go ahead.
quickly, we talk to, of course, administrators, but remember the provost is here for 1 year. It's a temporary provost, and after she'll fly somewhere else. And also, you can talk as much as you can, but they politely listen what's going on. We have been talking for the last 3-4 years on and off with administrators, so we are still very impatient and see as far as conclusion and results.
Well, that about wraps up this show, right?
We have like 30, 40 seconds.
All right, Doug. Well, when we come back tomorrow, I want to go toe-to-toe on this policy, because I think Pell Grants are a pretty bad idea, and expanding them sounds like an even worse idea. So I would be happy to be the aggressive legislature to your proposal.
You're on, John.
All right. I want to say thank you to our guests. And again, they'll be here tomorrow to talk about, we just kind of laid the foundation today, and tomorrow we're really going to get it on. Okay. And then we also have some folks from the philosophy department. If you haven't gotten enough yet,
It's about free speech today.
talk about freedom of speech, as we've just been doing that. So we're going to come right back after the top of the hour. And looking for your more of your phone calls at 721-1290, 1-800-568-5309. We'll be right back. Welcome, everybody. Hour number 2 of Talkback is underway. Brought to you by Western Montana, New Holland, south of the Y on Highway 10, across from the Axeman, now offering special financing, 0 down up to 84 months approved credit. Spray Green Lawn, providing lawn aeration services, fertilization, and weed control. You could save 15% if you mention this message. Call 207-9273. Office City, celebrating 100 years in business. See them for office supplies and furniture, price match guarantee, and free delivery. And by AAA, they pay for itself with discounts on big brands. Join now, get a free canvas tote. Visit AAA.com/Montana. Okay, here we are. Oh, you brought treats. I like it. All right. Or perhaps
it is Free Speech Day. We have no idea what's in that box.
I think
it could be anything.
I think these are symbolic of our rights of free speech that are boxed and contained and need to be released and free. I don't know. I'm just wondering. Anyway. So good morning, everybody. Welcome once again to Talkback. I'm Peter Christian. John King is over there. And we have special guests in the studio from the philosophy department at the University of Montana. It's kind of an all-you day today. So, John, what are we talking about today?
Well, I believe we're talking about free speech and hate speech. We have in the studio Professor David Sherman and Soazig who we've had on many times for other philosophy shows. So I'm going to just kind of kick it over to Soazig, since you're the known entity here, to kind of introduce David and get us going, okay?
Sure. Thank you for having us. So David Sherman, Professor Sherman, I don't know how to say that. I should have asked what you want to be called. Anyway, David is an interesting character. I would say that a funny story about David, and I don't know if I'm totally allowed to say that, but a while ago when we had a party at my house and we had some students over who had graduated or just graduated, we were late at night, and one of the students told us, everybody falls in love with Sherman at some point.
Okay.
He's extremely charismatic, extremely interesting. He has a law degree, also a philosophy, a PhD in philosophy. He's working in continental philosophy and more recently in political philosophy and the philosophy of economics. So it's quite a wide array of interests. And
So in other
you'll see
words,
for yourself.
he's the smartest guy in the room, right? Is that what you're trying to
Probably, yes.
say? All right. Well, first of all, Professor Sherman, thanks for being with us.
My pleasure.
We appreciate it. So now we are here to talk about the concept of free speech. Is that right? So who wants to start? Let's jump in. First of all, I am Mr. Dummy. I'm Mr. Everyman. I always ask the obvious question. Okay. And I need to know, whenever we have discussions like these, I need a definition. What is your definition of free speech?
Well,
And you need to get right on top of that microphone, David. There you
okay.
go.
I think as an initial matter, I think there's a mistaken belief that anyone supports some absolute conception of free speech. So the term really is a term of art. Even the most ardent proponents of free speech wouldn't deny, for example, that there are time, place, manner restrictions on free speech.
Okay.
I think it's also the case that no one would deny that even with respect to content, which is really what we're concerned about, there are restrictions, slander, libel, violation of copyright laws.
Profanity. Especially when you're on the radio.
I should remind everyone we are governed by the FCC
Yes,
still,
yes.
despite the topic.
Yes.
Thank you for the reminder.
Yes.
And so, I mean, there's more to say, but I'll kick it over to Soazig. What we're talking about is a question that already is in some bracketed within a particular area.
Okay.
And then the question is, how do we adjudicate what the relative rights are within that area that most all people agree upon?
So you have to select your if you will your field of battle before you can begin to.
Well, in some
Step
sense,
in
the field of battle has already been selected for
Right,
us, but
yeah.
but on fairly rational grounds and not ones that most people would dispute.
Okay, Soazig?
Yeah, as I was intending to say something very similar, I think that's the kind of the common ground that we all agree that there are some restrictions, right? Some obvious restrictions. So think about child pornography, think about crying fire in a theater. Those are the classic examples where almost everybody agrees that this is not a kind of free speech that should be protected. But there are restrictions. And interestingly, what I find also interesting is that it's not the kind of, this is all over the spectrum in terms of party lines, right? So when you think about the 70s and the 80s, people who were defending free speech were largely liberal, on the liberal side, thinking about, protests against the war and also issues around obscenity. Now, recently, around the 90s, we turn into kind of the opposite, where more conservative voices are defending free speech against a trend, which tends to want to regulate, let's say, hate speech, or more recently, all the kinds of issues surrounding safe space and the kind of offense you can have on campuses. So my point here is to say that all over the spectrum, there's some points at which people have strong intuition that there are some kinds of speech that needs to be regulated. So I think that's a given. And then, as David said, the question is, what do we regulate, right? And that we disagree on. But there is a common ground. So the common ground is really that nobody thinks that all kinds of speech just has a right to be out there just for the sake of it.
Okay. Go ahead, John.
So basically, the debate is now between more free speech or less free speech on a spectrum. And there's going to be certain limitations that almost everybody is going to say should exist. But there are different reasons for those limitations, and that's kind of what my question is going to drive at. So when you gave the example of fire in a crowded building, the reason there's a limitation on that particular example is because people could get hurt and die in an immediate sort of fashion. Your speech, however free it may be, could lead to the death of someone in quick succession. But when I write a story and there's a vivid portrayal of someone dying in a burning building, and it might arouse passion in someone to go and do that act, that's quite a bit different. It's a different degree of kind of the same thing, but the distance from the writing to the actual spoken word is a great distance in the minds of many people. So how do you adjudicate what type of speech to cut back on and when the harm could possibly occur?
Okay, well, hang on to that answer because I have to exercise the free speech of our sponsors. And without them, we wouldn't be here. So we're going to come right back. By the way, all 4 of our lines are open if you want to get into this conversation. I'm sure you will, as you always do. 721-1290, we're coming right back. Hey, we're back on Talkback. 721-1290 is the number. Professors in the studio from the University of Montana Department of Philosophy, Professor David Sherman, Soazig, and we're talking about the concept of free speech. We've already done a little bit of categorizing and defining. And so which direction are we going here, John?
Well, one of the things I wanted to kind of lead into before was the restriction of speech based on the types of medium that's used. And I gave the example of maybe shouting something in a crowded building, which is a very common one in American jurisprudence. But to give you a concrete example, take a book like Mein Kampf, which is banned in Germany, I think, still to these days, and is permitted in the United States if you want to own it for whatever reason you might. That written document obviously inspired a lot of hatred and violence. I would say even deaths were caused, partially due to that particular document. And yet it's not seen in America as quite at the level of shouting "kill them" to a group of Jewish people while you're wearing Nazi paraphernalia in a city, right? So are there certain mediums that you think, David, should be allowed free space when it comes to free speech? And I think the written form seems to be one that most Americans agree you can write almost anything you want.
Right. No, I think you're exactly right. I mean, yelling fire in a crowded theater, that's exactly time, place, and manner problem. You give rise to all sorts of problems. People stampede to the door. There are deaths. I mean, this puts it within the framework of a more general question, which is, I mean, the debate, it seems to me, excuse me, is really between harm and offense. I mean, this is the continuum on which this battle is being fought out. Mein Kampf is absolutely offensive. The question then becomes whether it's harmful. And one of my concerns is that when we're regulating speech, usually what we're regulating is more the symptom than the underlying problem, and that in regulating the symptom, we give rise to a whole set of other underlying problems. If it's the case, for example, that Mein Kampf is able to get traction, we have deeper problems than simply the fact that this book is putting it out there. And what I'm concerned about is addressing the more fundamental underlying structural problems that would make people amenable to this kind of message. I wouldn't regulate the message itself, at least in this context.
There's another thing, and that is who decides what is, offensive or not, and who decides what is offensive or not. You see what I mean? And so when you bring all these things out, the first thing that comes into my head is who is the authority figure that says that's this and that is that? Soazig, go ahead.
Ooh. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. So first off, I think that what David just did, which is to move from the question of the medium to the question of the spectrum between harm and offense, is probably the right thing. I don't think that there are the kinds of media that are necessary, have to be protected. I'm not sure that we can do that. I think the more interesting question, the more relevant question is how much offense or harm is done. Now, we have the harm principle, right? What is when you cause harm to others and you want to regulate? As simple as you're free as long as you don't harm others. But we also most of us, all of us, or at least our liberal state, the state that we built, has accepted that some kinds of offenses have to be regulated. Not all of them, and we always, so typically, there are some clear cases. Now, the limit is difficult to put, but there are some clear cases. So someone who is naked on the lawn in front of the courthouse touching himself is probably, there's a consensus in our society that this is not okay. Now, it's not necessarily harmful, right? He can be totally harmless guy touching himself. But we tend to think that, no, that's actually not, that's offensive.
It's culturally inappropriate.
But yeah, absolutely. But so how do we draw the line? Well, the way we've been doing it in this country, I believe, is in terms of consensus, right? So whatever is consensual, where everybody feels like this is an offense to everybody, then that's where we regulate. As soon as there is some kind of disagreement, then what we've been doing is agree to disagree on those things.
Okay, so go ahead.
I think for a good example of that is the naked bike ride we had in Missoula 2 years ago, or just last year or so. That couldn't happen in every American city, I don't think.
Yeah, but it did happen in Missoula. But we do have a caller, so let's get you guys. You got your headphones on. So, Mark, thank you for holding. You're on the line with David and Soazig. Go ahead.
Hi, I got a question. Before the internet, I think everything was sort of like sanitized by editors, and especially newspapers, radio. Time delay, they get turn off your comment if they wanted to, or TV. But since the internet, I think we're more free speech because no one can really, if you want to say whatever you say on the internet, Twitter, Facebook, probably 50 others that I don't know about. I think that's a big improvement.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Appreciate the call. So do you agree? Do you think the internet is a step forward in free speech?
My inclination is to think yes. Historically, there were all sorts of debates concerning access to radio, access to newspapers, and in fact, there was this interesting set of cases. I mean, they've all gone away, but if I remember correctly, there was something once called the Red Lion Doctrine, which you may remember being in radio, which is basically that insofar as you give someone the opportunity, say in a political context, to take a particular position, you have to give someone equal time to respond to that position. I think that case has subsequently been shut down. But there, at that very same time, there was a case concerning newspapers where the Red Lion Doctrine wasn't extended to the newspapers. It was rejected. And so the point is, I think now more than ever, there is a lack of access to appropriate media for purpose of people actually getting out their messages. And when you're talking about the internet, now all of a sudden you're able, for good or ill, to be able to propagate a message and get it to a larger number of people in a way you wouldn't have had access previously.
Okay, we're going to take another break. All four lines are open, 721-1290. We're just kind of skimming the surface. We're diving in here. We'd love to have you dive in with us. Just bring a swimsuit. 721-1290 is our number. What's that?
I said, or don't, if you want to be used as one of Soazig's examples.
There you go. We'll be right back. Okay, we're back on Talkback. 721-1290 is the number, and we have guests in studio, professors at the University of Montana, David Sherman, Soazig Lobillon, and let's get Emmett on the line. Emmett, what's up? You're up. You're up early.
Thanks for taking my call. It's a wonderful discussion, but, I think it's so important as far as free speech is to understand what our founding fathers wanted us to have free speech for. It was for political and religious freedom of speech, to speak out about your government and say such and such is a sin from the pulpit, from the radio, from the television, any print or, media. They didn't know about radio and television. But I'm appalled by certain elements in our society that want to shut down free speech and have it only for, the liberal side. Rush Limbaugh has a right to speak. Michael Savage has a right to scream. So does Alex Jones. And we all do. We have a right to say, homosexuality is a sin or whatever. In Canada, that's banned. You cannot say anything, quote unquote, offensive in Canada. You can be arrested. In America, it's not about freedom to make pornography. It's freedom for political speech. And I'm really upset about a lot of schools, like elementary schools or even college campuses, having free speech zones only, and in the rest of the time you can't talk about the political issues of the day in whatever way.
Real quick, Emmett, just to bring this home a little bit, there is a space on the University of Montana campus, I believe, where you're supposed to be able to go and advocate, and
Wonderful.
can get.
It should be the
this
whole
is true, right?
university.
We had some students get in trouble and because they weren't in this area when they were talking about, I think, political or something.
Yeah, that's horrible. It should be the whole university. We should have the whole university be free speech zone. The whole university. This is where, we've got to always support free speech. An example in point. Missoula Community Access Television. It's a wonderful organization. I love MCAT. But about 25 years ago, they had this whole hubbub at the city council where a lot of citizens were offended by what was being said. Thankfully, the city council, voted to keep MCAT. But, spaces like that, or even Talkback, you should be able to talk about whatever. As long as you're not saying slander like such and such in the community is a pedophile when you don't know whether he is or not. But like the president, the Clintons, I have a right to say the Clintons are in the wrong. They're committing these horrible things.
Okay, real quick, Emmett. We have guests in the studio.
We have to limit your free speech now by shifting over to David. Thanks for your call, Emmett.
Well, hold on. Do you have a specific question for our guests? I guess not. Okay, never mind. Go ahead. Sorry. Anyone. Go ahead.
I can go. That's fine. Look, Emmett. So you're voicing here some genuine and legitimate concerns about protecting free speech. Now, as I said earlier, I don't think that there is a special party that's been going against free speech or not. It has come from both sides on different issues. On one side, it's usually obscenity, it's usually protests and civil rights. All those were difficult things to accept from the more conservative side, if you want to call them that way. On what you call the liberals, it has been about more hate speech and all the issues around safe place, around rape. For the regulation on campus, as the only regulation I know is that you have to be 15 feet from a building. And that's for any kind of view. But then you can say pretty much whatever you want. It's just to avoid the harassment of people when they come out of building. And, I think we are a typical case here where we regulate minimally, and we are on a spectrum between the banning. There is no banning but there is some regulations on how to do it. And I don't think that's a particularly offensive or particularly awful thing. Now, as I said before as well, when you talk about Canada, and you could say same things about France, about that we tend to regulate more, regulate more than the U.S. do. Again, it's a question of what you find offensive. It is not the case that everything offensive is regulated. You have a legal right to be a jerk. That's fine. But there are some things that societies, liberal societies, the societies we live in, and liberal not in the sense of conservative versus liberal, the kind of state we've built, the democracy, the Western democracies, we decide as a society that is a consensus over certain kinds of speech that have to be regulated. I mentioned the naked guy on the courthouse lawn. Everybody agrees on that one. Now there will be a case-by-case decision, but then there is no broad stroke there.
Go ahead, John.
I want to step in and throw a match on this fire real quick. So I know from an off-air conversation we had that Soazig doesn't believe Mein Kampf should be allowed in print, and that David believes that it should. Now, this is a pretty clear case. Everyone, if you don't know, Mein Kampf was written by Adolf Hitler and helped inspire his regime. I think everyone was forced to have a copy at one point in Nazi Germany. It was a really it was a flashpoint in history, basically, this document. Now, I would like you to kind of explain, Soazig, your case for why this document should be banned.
Okay, we're going to do that when we come back. I'm sorry. Okay, give her a chance to.
Fine.
She's ready. She's ready to go, and I'm sure David as well. 721-1290 is our number, or 1-800-568-5309. Now we also have the freedom to access our Facebook page. So we're coming right back. And we are back on Talkback, 721-1290. Okay, now, I as I always am wont to do, I jump right in the middle and interrupt the conversation. So we're talking about Mein Kampf, and Soazig, you were going to state your case for why you believe nobody should be allowed to read it. Go ahead.
Right, so it's a difficult issue. First, I want to recognize that those are difficult, and it's not that that those kinds of questions have easy answers, straightforward answers. Now, in the case of Mein Kampf, I guess, and it's probably largely a cultural thing, but I grew up in France in the aftermath of World War II, and there is a clear sense in Europe that Mein Kampf has done a lot of is offensive to everybody. Is intimidating, is inciting violence, and that's all kinds of wrong with that book. And so this is a kind no matter whether it's words or words on paper or words spoken, there is something basically deeply wrong with that book, and that everybody find offensive, like genuinely offensive. So just like in the case we talked about, the point we talked about before, when there is something that is felt as offensive for everybody, then we tend as societies, the democratic societies, to think that we should just get it out of the way. But I'm not saying that this solved the problem of racism, obviously. That's what David probably would say. Is like, it doesn't solve any problem to put it out there, but I don't see the good. So I would also address the further issues and the problem of the rise of racism. I mean, we can talk about that in Europe or here. Mm-hmm. So banning Mein Kampf is not going to be we're good, racism has disappeared. No, this is not what I'm talking about. I think we should do both.
All right, go ahead. What do you think, David?
Well, I want to draw the line somewhat differently. So, again, we've been sort of hovering around these terms, harm and offense. right? And I don't think that anything should be banned whatsoever on the grounds that it's offensive. The problem, I think, comes in that it's very difficult sometimes to parse what is merely offensive and what is both offensive and harmful. And so I think the more interesting question is, as offensive as something might be, say, for example, Mein Kampf, the question then is, what is the likelihood that this thing is going to give rise to harm which involves the violation of other people's rights? And then that raises, I think, a further question, which is the causal nexus. So, for example, when we were talking about time, place restrictions earlier, screaming fire in a crowded theater immediately leads to a stampede and death, and so you've got this tight causal nexus. Now, here in the context of Mein Kampf, it may be the case that this is just something that brings together a group of people, and you've got lots of different movements, lots of different causal leaps, and then all of a sudden you have harm. And so then the question really becomes, how tightly yoked must the notion of harm be? At least to my mind, how tightly must the offense be yoked to harm before we can say that the offense itself is harmful and therefore ought to be proscribed?
I wanted to ask Soazig a follow-up question on your cultural argument for banning Mein Kampf. And it's basically this. You argue that France and maybe Germany should ban Mein Kampf, but do you extend that to the rest of the world? Should all countries have to ban Mein Kampf? Or is it just in the culture milieu of these countries that kind of went crazy because of it?
Well, because of the harm it's already caused.
That's a good question. I don't know. No, it's a good question. I'd rather say I don't know rather than BS you. It's a good question. You're right that this particular country, the country we live in, has a very different history, which is in which free speech has much more importance than. And you haven't. I mean, you've lived World War II, but not in the same way that we did, right? In Europe, we can probably agree on that. And so. You know, in a sense, it's an empty question, because if I am consistent with myself, then I think that we should ban what the entire society thinks is offensive for everybody. This is obviously not the case in this country, right? So it's the answer is obviously no for this country.
Okay, let's get Dave on the line. Dave, thank you for
a pragmatic argument.
Okay, Dave, thanks for your patience. You're on Talkback. Go ahead.
Yeah, good morning. I read Mein Kampf many years ago, and I found it kind of boring.
Okay.
Yes, it was very repetitive and boring. As far as free speech goes, I defend Rush Limbaugh's right to say that liberals are enemies of America. But, free speech, I also defend the right of people to be offended by what they say.
Sure.
Free speech is not necessarily free. I mean, there is going to be opposition, and you have to be ready to take the punches when you punch out there. And I support totally free speech, and it's just a matter of what people believe, and you're going to have opposition.
Yeah, but you have to be willing. You have to be willing to listen to what other people have to say, and not just immediately slap them down because you disagree with them.
Well, that's certainly part of it. But if you're going to speak controversially, you're going to get slapped down. That's just part of the process. I mean, if you're going to talk about any really controversial issue, you have to expect blowback, and that's good because that's free speech too.
Well, when you say blowback, though, are you saying blowback enforced by the state?
No,
because that's what some people are arguing for. I understand. Every time you make a social comment in a social sphere, there's a social impact. You might be looked more positively or more negatively by the people that hear you. But there's a different case that people are making, that when I'm offended, the government should come and enforce my offense.
I disagree with that. Offended is just as good as free speech. It's also free speech. And I think government should stay out of the middle of that argument.
All right, Dave. Thanks for the call, sir.
Yeah.
Appreciate that. Always a pleasure. And we're going to come right back after this quick timeout. David Sherman, Soazig. We're talking about free speech. I want to know what you think. If you have an opinion, 721-1290 is our number. We'll be right back. Okay, we're back on Talkback, and we're visiting with Professors David Sherman and Soazig. We're talking about freedom of speech. They're professors of philosophy at the University of Montana. Go ahead, John.
I wanted to do a quick challenge to Soazig on this banning Mein Kampf. And I think there are unseen harms that you should consider about doing such a thing. One of those is to whitewash history. If you don't know what people said at a certain point in history, you run not only the risk of repeating it, but of being ignorant of what might have led to the terror of the Nazi regime. Secondly, this argument will be used and can be used if you buy into it to go for potentially getting rid of other books. I think the Communist Manifesto might be one on some people's short list.
The Bible.
Of things to ban. If you go down this route of, I mean, if you look at the death and if you look at some of the outcomes, people will make that argument. And I think that it's dangerous to do so, especially if you're a philosophy teacher.
Or a history teacher. Right?
Or a history teacher.
Yes, okay. So about the whitewashing the history, while the book is banned in France, you teach it in history classes, and you have excerpt from it. So in the context where there is someone who knows about the history and explains it, and we watched, I remember I was 14 the first time I saw one of the most terrible movies I've ever seen in my life. And I told my mom the day before I was going to see that movie, and she looked at me as if I was absolutely, I had to be prepared. Anyway, so we do that. Obviously, there is no whitewashing whatsoever just by banning a book. In the context of history classes, it's been taught, it's been displayed, everything is out there. In a way that is very important to anybody who's teaching history or philosophy. Actually, my philosophy teacher in high school spent an entire class period reading the names of the Nuremberg trials. It was very boring. Anyway, but he made a point, I guess. Now about the slippery slope, the fact that if we ban one, when will we stop? Well, again, as any slippery slope argument, it is not because there is not a clear distinction, that there is no distinction whatsoever. Yes, of course, we don't want to ban all the books. We don't want to ban Lolita on the basis of banning child pornography. There are tons of cases like this where we are, on the fence. We are on a moving target, but that target exists, and we all agree that there are some things that we don't want to see out there, some things that we do want to see out there, and then there is a gray area, and that's going to be to take some serious thinking why we do this or not, right?
No, I don't agree with you that it's a slippery slope argument. A slippery slope is a logical fallacy where you don't have evidence to back up the causal relation between one case and another. And I mean, when you look at a book like Mein Kampf and the number of deaths it led to, and you look at a book like the Communist Manifesto and the number of deaths that it led to, they're pretty substantially different. And there's more for the Communist Manifesto. That should, I think, be a cause of alarm for those that are banning books because of their outcomes instead of because of their messaging.
Okay, David, we haven't heard from you. Go ahead.
Right. Well, I think there are a number of things to respond to. I mean, my first concern is with the notion of what we all agree upon, the of courses and the consensus. I mean, right? The Bill of Rights itself was explicitly designed to protect individuals against what might be an oppressive consensus and an oppressive majority. I would also say I don't think these books themselves led to you can't lay at the doorstep either of Mein Kampf or at the Communist Manifesto, the responsibility for the deaths.
There had to be a fertile field there for whatever is in there.
There had to be a fertile field, and there were a whole variety of intervening actions, claims, responses that lay the groundwork for that sort of response. And that comes back to what I suggested earlier about what is the relationship between the offense and the harm, and that they need to be very tightly yoked, that the offense has to give rise to a harm. It has to give rise to a harm that's relatively proximate, not the notion of, but for this book, something down the line would
So
not
the
have
average
happened.
person has to be able to see a causal. Is that right? Or
I'm not sure if the average person has to be able to see the causal. This is where I would move off that. I mean, there's a well-established case law, I think, concerning, well, what constitutes a proximate cause is, such that we can talk about, in this case, the offense directly leading into the harm, and what just happens to be something within a whole network of cases that ultimately gave rise to the untoward consequences.
Go ahead, Soazig.
Right. So following up on this, I think if I tend to agree that it's a question of how close the harm is. And I would suggest that there is a genuine relevant difference between the Communist Manifesto and Mein Kampf in terms of the proximity. Mein Kampf is asking for violence, is inciting violence. The Communist Manifesto is not. Now what? So, revolution? Well, it's not. It's so. Revolution is some kind of violence, but it's not harm to a certain kind of people, right? That's a very different thing. Like, let's kill the inferior people is a very different, very kind of claim than let's throw away a government that is not appropriate or not making us happy.
Okay, so our phones are going nuts here, so go ahead.
Yeah,
I think that, a lot of the basis of the Communist Manifesto is class distinction and treating different groups differently because of the classes they're in.
Okay, so let's get to the phones. Eric, thank you for holding and your patience. You're on with our guests. Go ahead.
This isn't Eric.
Oh, I'm sorry.
This is Catherine.
Oh, Catherine, hang on just a second. Okay, Eric, you're up. Go ahead. My apologies.
Oh, no problem. Hi. I was thinking about our founders' intent with with freedom of speech, just like the right to keep and bear arms, is that these were recognized in the context of a self-governing people. That is that if one were to stand up and say something, it would be from a moral and self-governing context, or a spirit of God animated person. And so a person like that is not going to stand up and say something like, I'm a sodomite, you should be too, because it's a violation of the law of God. And in the same way, a person who has arms, even if they have a nuclear warhead, a self-governing person is not going to murder millions of people with it. And so I think that needs to be taken into that these laws were put in, or these things, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, were put in place for a self-governing people.
Okay, thanks, Eric. Appreciate the call. We have to take a 1-minute timeout, and I know you guys are both chomping at the bit here, so we'll be right back. Stay with us. Okay, we're back, and we are rapidly, and I mean rapidly, running out of time here because we talk about philosophy. There's a lot of words going on out there. So Eric just brought up a couple of things, and Soazig, did you? Sure. Go ahead.
Yeah, so it's an interesting point. So there are two things that I would say about what you said, Eric. I think you're touching something important that we should count in a democracy on people to be responsible and to be genuinely good people, self-governing. And then we don't. In a sense, I would also add a second point to that, is that we don't necessarily need to put a religious view on this. In fact, if my history is right, the founders precisely tried to make the state to be a non-religious one and based more on the kind of 18th century Scottish Enlightenment idea that we have some kind of moral sense, and that because of that moral sense, no matter what our differences in terms of religion are, we can build this democracy on the basis of the idea that individuals are going to behave relatively well and follow some kind of moral principles, except for Catholic and atheists at the time, of course. But and this is kind of a joke, but it's true.
Maryland did it.
But besides the fact that I don't think that the religious part of it needs to be in that story, this specific religion needs to be in that story. Obviously, they thought there was a religious part of it, but there is this idea, you're right, that we have some moral sense. Now, in terms of free speech, I don't know what that means. So I'm not sure exactly what the consequences are in terms of how we should regulate free speech.
David, go ahead.
Right. I guess my concern with Eric's assumptions are, well, if the assumption is that we're talking about morally responsible individuals who are going to speak properly out there and debate the issues appropriately, then a lot of what we're talking about becomes superfluous because there's not going to be these sorts of problems.
And unfortunately, it's not happening.
Right. and the fact of the matter is, let's be honest, there are many people out there who are not responsible. And so the question for Eric, firstly, is, well, shall we have a litmus test for who's responsible and who's not? And then how far do you actually support free speech if on the basis of your litmus test you decide someone's not responsible? Does that mean we can then close them down? I mean, the whole purpose of, I think, of the First Amendment and freedom of speech is that we ought not be in the business of making those sorts of fine-grained distinctions. And the idea is by getting all of these ideas out there and letting them get hashed out, we actually, in some sense, will enable people to become more morally responsible and engage in better political debate.
Okay, let's get Catherine on. Hi, Catherine, you're on. Go ahead.
Okay, several things here. It seems like there is a question of objective versus subjective definition of what hate speech is, for example, or criminalized speech. And one of you brought up the subject of harm, and harm has to be very narrowly defined as I think as actual physical in terms of concrete harm to tie criminal consequences to that. Unfortunately, these days it seems that it depends on who defines the speech, and it's being defined as opinions with which somebody disagrees, then defines the speech as xenophobic, homophobic, racist, sexist, yada yada yada. And because of that, the push is now to criminalize opinions based on somebody's hurt feelings. And that's a problem.
Okay, so who wants to take that? Thanks, Catherine.
Sure.
Go ahead.
Well, I mean, firstly, I want to say I agree with a fair bit of what Catherine says. I think that we want to define harm narrowly. But the question then becomes, right, how exactly do we set up the boundaries? And there really is a gray area there. I mean, I think Catherine's suggesting it's simpler and clearer. There's bodily harm. But there are certain sorts of things, for example, like sexual harassment, right? Is that speech we're going to permit? Well, no, we ought not permit it, although there's not literally physical harm. There are all sorts of things that this entails. You stalk someone. Well, this ought not be permitted either. And so, right, part of the complexity here is that what we're doing is we have to draw some fairly fine lines at borderline actions. But in terms of the general spirit of what she says, I think she's right. We don't want to expand the notion of harm to such a point that basically we swallow up the protection.
Okay, go ahead, Soazig.
Yeah, I largely agree with that, even if we would put probably the line in different places. But I think that the idea that there is a clear, obvious answer that solves all the issues in terms of is it physical harm or is it something else, I think it's a mistake. I do believe that we should be careful, and it's clear that there are lots of there might be some abuses. But again, I think that the line is more difficult, more complex than just physical harm. And again, in terms of racism, xenophobic, etc., I again remind you that on the other side of the spectrum, there are also other battles that are going against free speech in terms of obscenity, protest against wars, burning flags, and all those things. So I don't think that we should. I think we should recognize that everybody has his own problems with free speech on one issue or the other.
Okay, and we're almost out of time, so go ahead, John.
Quick statement from Susie. She says, I think comments should have to be identified by the person making them. People think they can say nasty things because it's online, and they are exercising their free speech rights. I always identify myself because you should stand behind what you say and not be a coward. When you talk about free speech, do you think people have a right to free anonymous speech?
I actually think they do. Firstly, I'm very sympathetic to her position. I think one of the deep problems here is that, for example, on the internet, there's a kind of anonymity where people take on different persona, sometimes that are diametrically opposed to who they actually are. But the idea here is that at the end of the day, if we're concerned with free speech and enabling people to express their ideas, put them out there and be debated, it ought not matter who it is that's actually making the claim, although quite frankly, I have a lot more respect for people who are willing to take on the attribution.
Right. Susie, I agree with you. For the internet, I want to put my name out there, and I feel more responsible for what I say when I put my name out there. I do believe that being able to be anonymous is also important. So I'm thinking a particular case here. In academia, there has been some some outcry about sexual harassment from professors towards young students. And there was a website where young women could actually talk about things anonymously. And that's important that they remain anonymous. Their career can be in danger.
And we are completely out of time. Thank you both for being with us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Tomorrow, we're going to have some, the same folks that were in the first half hour. We'll have them back next tomorrow.
And we might have the lieutenant governor.
That would be awesome. All right. You guys have a great day. Enjoy the sunshine and turn before you burn.